I'm very excited to have this panel because we've been sort of talking big theory and big ideas, and we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts here. We have an incredible panel here. We have Natasha Sorin, who is at the Treasury Department, is an outstanding economist who I learned a lot about from the tax gap and is now tackling the tax gap in real time. We have Mike Schmidt, who has been tasked with handling a lot of the CHIPS investments from the CHIPS Act and also played a big role in getting the child tax credit out monthly, which I think is one of the more impressive things that the federal government did last year. And we have Jigar Shah, who is a very experienced private sector green energy investor who suddenly has a few $100 billion in loan authority at the Department of Energy to work on the green energy transition. So I'm very excited to have everyone here to talk about sort of the nuts and bolts of how you put an industrial policy together so that it works equitably, fairly, with union input. So just to get into things, why don't we go down and talk a little bit about what each of you are working on in your respective roles and sort of what programs and investments you've been focusing on lately. So Natasha?
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. My name is Natasha Sorin. I am a counselor at the Treasury Department focused on tax policy and implementation. As Dylan mentioned, I come to government from an academic background. I'm a professor in my previous to government life, where I spent a lot of time thinking about tax administration, and particularly why in the US, despite the fact that we are the most modernized economy in the world with such tremendous technological prowess, we have a tax administration system that doesn't reflect that. And that is incredibly important, as Dylan mentioned, as a matter of equity. Today in this country, if you're a worker who gets paid a salary, you are fully making good on your tax obligations. If you are a wealthy person who happens to accrue income in opaque ways, you're not. It's important as a matter of equity with respect to service that the IRS is able to provide to taxpayers. Tax filing in this country is a complicated and expensive process. It is, and getting the IRS to be able to answer taxpayers' questions when they have them just hasn't been something that the agency has been capable of in a real way. What I was working on over the course of the last year and a half was trying to think about ways in which to address some of these challenges. And the way that you do it is by giving the IRS the resources that they need to be able to serve the American people the way that they deserve, and to be able to make meaningful progress on the tax gap, which today costs the federal government 3% of GDP each year. We succeeded on that effort in the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides $80 billion in mandatory funding for the IRS over the course of the next decade to try to tackle these challenges in a substantial way. And so what I'm working on these days is trying to work with my IRS colleagues with respect to deliver on a strategic plan for what implementing on this promise is actually going to look like and what we're going to be able to do in short order for the American people. And it's been really exciting, and I'm thrilled to be able to be here and talk a little bit with all of you about that.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Schmidt. I am the program director for the CHIPS program office at the Commerce Department. I joined Commerce about a month ago to take on this challenge. Before then, as Dylan mentioned, I was at Treasury working with Natasha and her colleagues on tax-related issues. When you take a step back, it is no accident that the three issues represented on the stage are totally foundational to modern society. Tax administration is as old as government itself. Energy has been the foundation of our economy since the Industrial Revolution. CHIPS is newer to the party, but no less important. CHIPS are in everything. They are invisible, but they are like water in terms of our reliance on them. And I think the CHIPS Act is a statement from our country that says, we believe that investing in this industry is critical for our national and economic security, and we believe that the government has the capacity to make regional investments that are the foundation for regional economic growth and broad-based prosperity. And so we at the Commerce Department feel the obligation profoundly to do this well. The department has structured the work into two buckets. There's a $39 billion bucket, which is for the CHIPS incentives program. That's really about onshoring domestic manufacturing. That's the program that I'm managing. There's another $11 billion program that is focused on R&D, which is, again, a hugely important foundation of this, really about the innovation of the future. And obviously, we are working in a concerted way under the leadership of Secretary Raimondo and with our colleagues throughout the federal government to get this done.
Jigar Shah, I'm the director of the Loan Programs Office. I'd say that the Loan Programs Office has had a interesting timeline. We were quite busy from 2009 to 2011, and as the Secretary suggested in her confirmation hearings, we were dormant for a long time, and we are certainly back today. I do think that one of the things that we're in charge of is, yes, to put loans out the door and to support America's best innovators and ideas to be able to reach first-of-a-kind deployment and then, crossing the bridge to bankability to get to full market acceptance, right? So you can get to gigaton scale climate reductions. But I think the other piece that we're responsible for is actually achieving liftoff. I think that in the analysis that was done in the past, I think that Clean Tech 1.0 really did fail because the government didn't show up, right? And so I think it's important for us to note that it wasn't because the technologies weren't ready or they weren't worthy of, success. It was that the ecosystem that was created around those innovations weren't allowed to flourish, right? And so as a result, we ended up, doing what we intentionally wanted to do, was build a crap load of gas and build a bunch of LNG export terminals and things that we intentionally wanted to do. So I think this time around, there is a responsibility, not just on my shoulders, but obviously on the Secretary and the rest of the government's shoulders, to make sure that all the tools that we received create the ecosystem to make sure that you have successful deployment of, CO2 capture, nuclear power, geothermal, hydro, all the 25 sectors that we need in the President's National Climate Plan to get to the climate reduction goals that we've set forth for ourselves. And so that level of engagement between the private sector, institutional investors, and government really happens at the Loan Programs Office.
Wonderful. So one theme that's been sort of present throughout our entire discussion today is the importance for this kind of industrial policy to have a strong union component, a strong equity component. Why don't we go sort of in reverse order? Jigar, when you're looking through applications for loans, soliciting people to work with, how do you take those concerns into consideration? Since obviously a lot of success stories, like Tesla had DOE loans, and I think Elon would have a panic attack if UAW suddenly organizes workers. How do we make sure the next Tesla is organized, is involved in the labor movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think that once a project gets to the Loan Programs Office, by definition, like someone worked on it for 4 to 5 years and got it to where we want to go, right? So the cake's fairly baked by the time it gets to us. And so a lot of what we've been doing is we brought in this extraordinary woman, Amy Peterson, who ran all of the project labor agreements for New York City into our office. And we've frankly been having an extraordinary dialogue with the unions around what they want, and with the CEOs around what they want. And you can imagine the gulf was very wide, but they weren't wide because they wanted different things. They were wide because neither one of them understood the other. And so I think that we've been able to close that gap tremendously. And so we've been able to take the caricature out of the minds of the CEOs and say, actually, here's the value of working with unions. And we've been able to go to the unions and say, here's what the CEOs actually want from you in terms of the sort of milestones or the sort of things that they need. They need to ramp up more confidently, right? They need to be able to get to a certain level of productivity, all those things. And the unions have been really interested in signing up to those things, right? And so I think we've been able to do a very good job of making it better and easier to make sure that these things occur. and we are making permanent change. I'd say the same thing's true for EJ groups. There are many groups that, frankly, I've been working with for 10 years, who were really passionate about what they wanted to shut down, but weren't really passionate about what they wanted to build. And so having the conversation around, what do you want to replace the thing that you want to shut down with? Because you want jobs in your community, right? You don't want it to all shift to 3 states over. And I don't think that they've been as articulate about what they want to build. And so we've been able to facilitate that conversation. And I think the same thing's true with community benefits plans. For many cities and states, I would say that they really thought that they were competing for economic development. And in fact, many of these locations are actually quite unique, right? With rail access, with ability to go ports, et cetera, et cetera. And so they actually have a lot more negotiating power than they thought they did. And so educating them on the fact that they actually do have negotiating power, and here's what a best practice looks like on a community benefits plan, they're like, oh, we didn't know we could ask for all this stuff. And the CEOs actually want to give it to them. Like, that's the crazy thing. Like, it's not that the CEOs are like, oh, we want to save this money. The money is almost irrelevant. It's like, pick a number, 0.4%, let's say, of the revenue top line of these companies, to be able to support all the services in the community, to support all those things. But I don't think that the conversation was happening in a very tangible and real way. And so I think we've been able to do a good job facilitating that. It's not done yet, obviously, but I think we've been able to get people into a more productive place.
Mike, what's this experience been like in the chips industry?
Well, from a kind of program lifecycle standpoint, we're earlier. So we're kind of looking at our blank canvas right now, which is very exciting, and part of what makes this all so fun. One thing we're thinking a lot about is how are we measuring success? What are our, being very precise, ex ante about what our policy objectives are, and then being relentlessly focused on those objectives. And I think part of those objectives are around production-related metrics, right? We want a certain level of leading-edge logic chips in this country. We want to make investments in more mature chips in this country. We want to invest in the supply chain, et cetera. But then there are going to be a set of objectives that are not simply about production. They're about workforce, they're about labor, they're about community investment. And we need to be relentlessly focused on those as well. I think from the standpoint of where we're sitting now, the next big event for us is going to be our funding announcement. So in February, we will put out a funding announcement that says, here's how you apply. This is what we're looking for, right? And there we will be very clear, right? We have a set of expectations around things like workforce investment, labor standards, and then we will work on a company by company basis to make sure that to the extent we are supporting projects, those projects are consistent with our policy objectives.
And just as a baseline thing, it's the CHIPS and Science Act, and we've talked a bit about CHIPS. Can you tell me about the and science component? What are some of the other industries that you're working with and trying to find investments in?
So I am focused on the CHIPS.
Got it.
The kind of CHIPS program, so I won't speak to sandboxes I don't play in. But I will say that the R&D side of CHIPS is critically important, and it's one that I think needs to be deeply integrated with all of the R&D work that is happening throughout the federal government, whether that is in the labs.
We have a lot of big plans for the science part.
yeah. So I can defer to the Department of Energy on the science part. But,
you two were scheming in the green room about this. Natasha, how does sort of concerns about equity, you touched on this a little bit before, but concerns about sort of labor and racial and gender equity play into some of the projects you're working in?
Yeah, so I want to talk about it in kind of two pieces. So one piece is that the IRS itself, over the course of the last decade, the IRS has attrited 20% of its workforce. It has been an incredibly hard place to work, and at the same time, the IRS has been asked to do so much and has delivered so much on behalf of the American people over the course of the pandemic. Mike worked on the sort of advanceability of the CTC that lifted millions of children out of poverty. That's something the IRS takes great pride in having been a part of. they were responsible for sending out $1.5 trillion of life support to American households over the course of the last several years. And part of what our early stage conversations around implementation are of the Inflation Reduction Act is actually how do we invest in those workers who have been doing this work without the resources or tools that they have needed for far too long. And to that end, this is a conversation that we've been sort of actively engaged in with the NTU is how do we create a system where we finally have the resources at the IRS to invest in what people who work the 80,000 plus workforce of the IRS today has been asking for with respect to being able to provide childcare subsidies, being able to make the IRS into an institution that allows you to spend your entire career at the agency and grow into different types of roles across divisions of the agency. And that's a conversation that's very active, and we have a lot of sort of engagement that's underlying some of the early investments we're making in trying to staff up and trying to look at communities, particularly underserved communities in this country where there hasn't been an IRS presence over the course of the last 10 years to do face-to-face taxpayer assistance, and saying those are some of the first things that the agency is going to invest in. There's also a really important sort of equity component that comes with respect to serving taxpayers where they are and, frankly, enforcing the tax laws against those who today are evading. If you just look at the pure statistics, the reality is that over the course of the last decade, audit rates for millionaires have decreased by twice as much as audit rates for EITC recipients. That is astounding. It is not something the IRS chose or wanted. It is the result of the fact that they have attrited those revenue agents who have the capacity to spend thousands of hours poring over thousands of pages of corporate tax returns or partnership returns to do the work. We finally have the tools that we need to be able to make realistic choices about where those types of activities need to be concentrated going forward, and also about how to invest in voluntary compliance and how to make it easier for the vast majority of taxpayers who want to pay what they owe to do that. And how to make it easier, frankly, and this is like a fundamental shift in the way that the agency has thought about tax administration in the past. For a long time, when we think about tax compliance, you think about collecting taxes from people, so collecting what is owed. Fundamentally, what the IRS of the future is thinking about making sure that every single American gets access to the benefits to which they're entitled, and there's a system of making sure that that is a simple, effective, and immediate process. And those are really the kinds of sort of early stage conversations we're having and underlying principles that are guiding the way we're thinking about a strategic planning process for the agency over the course of the next decade. And it's work, oh, well, that's great. It's work that we're really excited about doing.
No, it's incredibly exciting work. As the one moderator without a book to plug, I did think I would plug the VITA program, which is an incredibly important program at IRS that helps low-income people file their taxes, get their earned income credit, get their child tax credit. I've been volunteering with Community Tax Aid, which is the DC group, for a long time. And I think I speak for everyone who volunteers there and hopefully for our clients in saying that we would love for you to put us out of business. There's a lot about the tax system that could be automated, that could be done better, a lot about filing that could be lower cost, and there are some exciting provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act around that. So Natasha, could you walk us through what was in there and how that's being operationalized in your office now?
Oh, this is super exciting with respect to, and let me start by talking about a little bit about what's in the Inflation Reduction Act and then also about where we're trying to go. In the Inflation Reduction Act is a call for the IRS to, and resources in fact, for the IRS to spend money on thinking about doing a survey of taxpayers to understand their beliefs and expectations and studying the viability of a direct file program in this country. Which would mean that, I'm just like I am so thrilled, honestly, that you all are as excited. It's like, I'm not normally in rooms when people are as excited about some of the tax administration questions as you all are. The secretary was in New Carrollton at an IRS facility a couple of weeks ago, and she remarked on a pretty astounding fact, which is that in Sweden, you can file your taxes on your cell phone. In Estonia, You can file your taxes within 5 minutes when you go to a government website that pre-populates your tax return for you and allows you to click a button to verify that that's accurate and send your sort of check to the government electronically in an incredibly streamlined way. My IRS colleagues got to spend time last week in Australia where they were meeting with tax administrators from across the globe, and they remarked to me about how in Australia, they spent a lot of time with the Australian Tax Authority. In Australia, benefits that come from the government are automated. It happens instantaneously. And there are a lot of, we can spend a lot of time talking about the various hurdles to data exchange or the fact that the EITC eligibility rules are incredibly complicated and changing those is going to require legislative action. But what's fundamentally true is that today, the architecture of the IRS is relying on a 1960s technological ecosystem where the programming language that underlies a large part of it is COBOL. So if you want to build a system that allows people to do some of what people in other countries, in less developed countries, are already able to do today, it starts and ends with being able to upgrade that technology and do so and design so in a way that actually facilitates some of these types of programs like Direct File in the future. And I am very happy to report to you that this is something the IRS wants to do. They call it real-time tax processing. It's something that we are incredibly invested in helping them do, and it's something that Congress is very invested in as they called for this study directly in the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's really exciting work, and it's actually at the forefront of the work that we're doing over the course of the early months of implementation.
Got it. Well, another big theme we've been discussing all day today is democracy and public engagement, and that's kind of it can be a fraught topic in discussions of industrial policy because there are ways in which a lot of public engagement can slow down projects that seem really important. Think of there's a major transmission line going through Maine that Maine voters voted to reject, even though it had clean hydropower that was going to sort of really help decarbonize New England. So Jigger, maybe we could start with you. How do you think about sort of interfacing with the public, explaining what you're doing to the public, while keeping your eye on the prize and making sure that sort of there isn't a heckler's veto of the people who seem most agitated about something?
Yeah, that's a easy question. I think that we should start by saying that we have had a fundamental desire on the part of public officials in this country to make sure that the public doesn't understand anything that I do, right? Like, no one really knows how their wastewater treatment plant works, right? No one really knows how the electricity gets to their house. No one really knows why we have donated 45% of all the land mass of every city to cars, right? And so the question really becomes, now that we want to remake our entire energy system, right? Let's be clear. If you're going to decarbonize the world, we're rebuilding the entire world, right? Not just air travel, but transportation, the way buildings work, the way, everything has to get rebuilt, right? So the money that we have in our office is catalyzing $10 trillion of investment in the country, right? And so some of this is kitchen table, right? So electric school buses, heat pumps, right? Solar on houses. Lots of this stuff is not kitchen table. Like the fact that we are still building wastewater treatment plants using 1970s approaches, because that's what everyone is comfortable with, and we've invented things that are 90% cheaper, but Long Island still chose to get rid of PFAS in their water in the most expensive way possible, right? Fine. So you have some of those issues, right? Then as it moves to democracy, the challenge really becomes how do you give these people air cover, right? Because we all hate everyone, right? Everyone is a villain. That's what cancel culture is, right? So if you look at the oil and gas industry, for instance, right? We all hate the oil and gas industry. So they have lost money systematically since 2009, right? The worst performing sector in the entire S&P, and they are now under scrutiny by Wall Street, right? So they don't get to do anything, right? Their shareholders tell them when to drill, where to drill, how to drill, et cetera. So now we want their expertise because they're the smartest people in the country at applied engineering. So we want them to do geothermal, how do we get them to do geothermal? You have to create some sort of ecosystem by which they can do that, right? We want them to do CO2 capture. We want them to do hydrogen. We want them to do whatever it is that they're really good at, right? Like, we want to try to figure that out. But the same thing is true for the electric utility, right? We know how to use technology to reconductor all the transmission lines to add 27 gigawatts of new, like, sort of renewable energy every year, right? Well, we have that technology, but like, how does that work with the regulator? How does that work with our authority? We have the 1706 program, which can pay for all of that upgrade, right? But like, everyone's like, well, but I don't know about transmission lines. I think they cause cancer. Like, they're all, by the way, done by the IBEW, right? So they're all union. And so when you think about all these different pieces, they're not working together. It's not like the IBEW is going, we are going to go into the regulator and we're going to figure this out, right? Or it's not like the EJ groups are going in and saying, we're going to like actually figure out how to do this because we want this, right? And so you're in this weird situation where, like, democracy has the ability to kill things, right? A lot of people like to kill things, I get that. But it really has not practiced how to build things, right? And so you're in this weird situation where everyone wants clean drinking water, everybody wants abundant electricity, right? Everyone, they don't want blackouts in the wintertime or the summertime. Like, everybody wants to make sure that there's abundant fuel, but they don't want the refinery down the street to actually be in operation. And so you're in this weird situation where we have all the solutions. Like, we spent 40 years developing them all. They all exist. They're sitting on a shelf on a website, like at the national labs. And we even know which companies want to build them, right? The venture capitalists have already put the money in. They're like down. Some of them have SPAC'd on Wall Street, whatever, right? But then we're like, wait a second, do we really want to go that fast? And I was like, well, climate change isn't stopping for anyone, so I think we want to go that fast. We need a 2-year consultation process before we want to like go that fast. Okay, but then carbon emissions stay exactly where they are. And so I do think that we have solutions, and I think we're ready to go at scale. But I do think that democracy is one of those things where, on the one hand, you can poll people who have never been taught about, you know, like CO2 capture and what they think about it. And then separately, you can educate people and say, here's what it means for your community, here's the jobs, here's what the average pay is, here's how we do it safely, et cetera. And then I think a lot of people will be comfortable with it if you educate them. But if you obviously go before they're educated and say, what do you think about all this new infrastructure going into the community? They're like, I'd like to leave my view shed exactly the way it is. I don't want a wind farm. And so I think that we are not doing the sequencing of that exactly right.
Got it. Obviously, I would hope chips manufacturing is less fraught than environmental sort of power transmission building. What are some of these sort of public communications issues you run into, and how are you thinking about it since you, as you said, you're growing your office from scratch, you're kind of writing the rules from the ground up?
So I think the first challenge is communicating to the public just how essential chips are, right? This is a newer part of our political conversation, and kind of having a concerted strategy to make everyone understand that every part of our modern life, whether it is our military, our energy supply, our refrigerator and our appliances, our healthcare devices, our automobiles, our computers, all of it depends on our ability to produce semiconductors, and having a vulnerable or not sustainable supply chain for semiconductors is a threat to our economic and national security, right? So we have to start there kind of before we move on to the broader messaging challenge. Once we get there, something I think a lot about though is that we are, the three of us are now in the business on a higher level of showing that government can deliver, showing that government can do big, hard things. I'm very conscious of that. And I think we talk about democracy and the kind of tensions of local control and local democracy with building projects. I think there's also a broader thing we're trying to do here, which is restore faith in public institutions and our ability to deliver. I frankly think that's that challenge is most relevant for the work Natasha is now doing, because every American interacts with the IRS more than any other face of the federal government. But I think for all of us, that's a significant obligation.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on that, Natasha? Since, as people have been saying all day, the IRS is now America's leading social assistance agency. It's in some ways, it's leading green assistance agency. How do you educate the public about that?
It is really about educating in that sense, but it's also about embracing challenge and using, this is going to sound a little kitschy, but thinking about building the IRS's brand in a meaningful way going forward. Because that's correct. The IRS is the largest administrator of federal benefits in the government. It is responsible for implementing on the president's green agenda. It is responsible for lifting millions of children out of poverty by advancing the child tax credit. Without a functioning administrator or an implementation organization, those are commitments and goals that we can't meet. And I have been struck by, I think that is about being clear about that being the charge and mission of the agency going forward. But I also think it is about, to Mike's point, we have to build trust and faith in being able to meet some of the commitments that we set for us. And again, the IRS has done, and I've been very lucky, I've been able to go all over the country and see IRS service centers and meet frontline workers who have been coming to work every single day of the pandemic, making sure that paper returns are processed and manually transcribing by hand line items of the returns that people send in today. They are tireless public servants, and they care deeply about their role in this government and their role in this economy. But what we need to be able to show is that a result of the fact that finally we have given the agency the tools that it needs to rebuild, it is going to rebuild and it is going to feel different for every single American household, because every household touches the IRS. And that means in the short run, and the Secretary outlined some of the ways in which these dollars are first going to get spent, as early as next filing season, you will have an IRS that has more customer service representatives than ever in its history available to answer the phones in more languages than ever before. You will have an IRS where every taxpayer assistance center is fully staffed. You will have an IRS where wait times on the phones are cut in half, but that's like the short run. The future of the agency needs to be that you can communicate with the IRS the way that you can communicate with your financial institution, which means on your phone, and that it's instantaneous and that it's seamless. And people are going to feel the difference when we are able to do that. And they are going to trust the IRS more, they're going to trust the federal government more, and they're going to believe in the future of what tax administration and more broadly what the government is able to deliver on if we're able to succeed. So really the proof is in the pudding in some sense, but I think it's a really important charge and one we take very, very seriously.
So that leads in very nicely to the first audience question, which is about some of the direct pay provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is, I will confess, a provision I did not know about until 30 minutes ago, but it seems very important for some of the Act's sort of provisions incentivizing green investment, because it means that nonprofits, local governments can access some of these benefits. I was curious if any of you, maybe starting with Natasha, have thoughts on how to educate local governments and nonprofits to know that this is something they can do, that they can access, say, green housing incentives.
Totally. I will say that part of, and actually Mike and I got to work on it when he was at Treasury, something people perhaps might not appreciate is that of this $80 billion in resources for the IRS, about $4 billion of those dollars are actually for implementing on the green provisions. So there actually is a very concrete tie between our ability to deliver on many of the credits that are in the Inflation Reduction Act and our ability to invest in the IRS from the perspective of IT transformation, but also from the perspective of taxpayer service. What service means in this particular context, and something we're thinking about as we're starting to stand up from an implementation perspective aspects of the green provisions, is it means, and a bunch of this is incredibly fast moving, right?
Yeah.
Because these are like deadlines that are in very short order with respect to guidance and sort of, and with respect to rulemaking in this space. What it means in very short order is being able to have robust engagement with stakeholders who have both expertise in this area to offer the IRS and Treasury as they think about complicated and thorny implementation issues, but also being able to invest in stakeholder outreach. And this is not just for green, this is for benefits writ large at the IRS. Investing in the outreach affirmatively to all those who are entitled to or should have access to these incredibly important benefit streams, and making that really a priority of the IRS and of Treasury going forward. And what that precisely looks like, I can't say that we've landed on entirely, but I will say that a foundational part of the work that we're doing today is trying to think about that as an affirmative part of the IRS's goal going forward, and not just for green and not just for the child tax credit, not just for the EITC, actually holistically as we think about outreach and engagement and the ways in which to make sure that people are able and businesses are able and taxpayers writ large are able to get access to all that they're entitled to in a way that'll help us grow our economy in a sustainable and equitable way.
I mean, there's also the semiconductor ITC also has a direct pay component in the legislation. And kind of putting my old Treasury hat back on, I would just note that the direct pay mechanism, just for the wonks in the room, it is a big deal. I mean, it is like a truly new, creative mechanism for providing benefits, and it's a big piece of business now for Natasha and the IRS to actually stand it up. I mean, you're talking about tens, hundreds of millions of dollars going out the door in a kind of parallel system to our normal system for processing tax returns, and in some instances to entities that historically haven't paid or filed taxes, right? So, just to say to the group, as you think about the next frontier of policy development, industrial policy, you should be looking at direct pay as an important stake in the ground going forward.
Wonderful. So the second question we got from the audience, just very quickly for Jigar, can you talk a bit about sort of how you evaluate loan programs after they've been issued for things like labor concerns, Justice 40, other equity goals? How do you enforce those by sort of looking back at loans that your office has made?
Yeah, it's maybe I'll start with the other question and then tie it together. So I largely invented solar tax equity in 2005. So I've
been
a part of the direct pay conversation for a very long time.
I didn't mean to cut you out of it.
No, I'm fine to be cut out of it. I think because it's I spent way too much time on this. What I would say to everyone though is that Treasury in 2009, when we passed the 1603 program, which was the first direct pay program, basically villainized the entire industry, right? And it was one person, reporting to Secretary Geithner who did that. And it set back the industry 4 years. So I think it's important for us to recognize how hard this is and why it was done in such a thoughtful manner, right? I think there's a lot of folks who sort of criticize, Senator Manchin, fine. But ultimately, there is a lot of fraud that occurs in these types of programs. And figuring out how we structure the rules properly to make sure that that doesn't occur, it matters. And there are a lot of people who are on the other side of these things, right? So I think we all need to think through what air cover really looks like. Because when you think about direct pay, what you think about is, I want us to close the gap with Australia. Right? We're at 3.2% of detached homes with solar on them. They're at 30%. We would like to get to 30%. Got it, right? Same with churches, same with schools, same with everything else, right? But the challenge is that the mechanism by which we do things is through the private sector doing the work and the government enabling them, right? That is the American approach to commercialization. And so when we think about these things, it is not something where the government does the work. The private sector does the work, and we enable them, right? And so when we engage in figuring out how to villainize these players, then they don't actually do these things, right? And we're talking about these things at trillion-dollar scale. We're not talking about a $100 million project or a $500 million project. We're talking about trillion-dollar scale. So the same thing's true in my office, right? So we're a commercial bank. We're a public policy commercial bank, but we're still a commercial bank. And so everyone gets treated fairly. They come in, they have to meet the statute, they have to meet the requirements, they come through, right? And so on the Justice 40 piece or on the union piece, et cetera, right? The statute says they have to pay Davis-Bacon for manufacturing, right? That's during, sorry, not manufacturing, for construction. And it's silent on operations, right? So that's what the statute says. So I'm executing on the statute. And the same thing's true for the Justice 40 benefits. So a lot of what we're doing is saying, this is better for your project. This is better for your rate of return if you have better trained workers, if you have a better relationship with the community, right? If you have these other things. I think it's really important for us to recognize the fragile place that we're in around what we're asking the private sector to do, and making sure that they feel comfortable doing it at trillion-dollar scale. Because if they don't, then all of this stuff goes to ruin, right? The jobs don't get created, the justice benefits don't occur, right? The decarbonization doesn't occur. And so part of, I think, my challenge is, my heart's in the same place as everyone else's is, but the implementation of this is super important. And as my co-panelists Michael and Natasha have said, this really is a trust-building relationship all around. And so we just got to figure out how to do both.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Give it up for our panelists. And